But before they got married, Mom insisted she would only get married in the church. Though they were living in sin and she didn't want to get married, when she was going to get married, it was church or nothing. And I'm just jumping in here because I realized I'd forgotten to record this part. The reason she was so set that she would only get married within the church is because of how the church treated her mother in Belgium, which was poorly, because she was a divorced woman who was getting remarried. So because of the way the church was at the time, if you only got one marriage. So if you got divorced and didn't get an annulment, then your second marriage, you were living in sin. Even if you got married, it does not matter. Living in sin, therefore you were sinning all the time. Therefore, you were excommunicated. So, and you were not allowed to take communion. And when my grandmother was dying in the hospital and they gave her last rites, they would only give her last rites on the assumption that if she suddenly magically got better, she could not go back to live with Jules. She could not go back to live with her husband because he was having last rites, which means that she was then, all her sin was washed away, so she could not go back to living in sin. And my mother said, I never want to go through that shit, and I'm getting married in the church. So back to my dad's annulment. So Daddy had to get an annulment. Now, of course, he had been married to his first wife for a long time, and they had 2 children, Richard and Meg, my half-brother and sister, whom I really have only met a couple times and do not know. But Lottie, his first wife, was Protestant. So therefore, they were not married in the church. Therefore, he could get an annulment. So they waited until the last minute, or he waited until the last minute because, apple doesn't fall far from the tree, that apple being me. They were like it was a few days before they were going to get married, and he had to get that annulment. So they went to the church to get the annulment, and they were like, there's only one guy who can do this, and he's about to go on vacation, so you better, but you just caught him. So he went and did like an hour-long confession of every single solitary thing he had ever done in his life. And then he got his annulment, and my parents got married on my mother's birthday, July. I keep saying January. It is July 7th, 1958. And they lived in New York. And then my dad was working at radio, and he was working at Broadway, and my mother was working in theater, and she was doing stuff also. She probably did some radio in New York. And then they turned around one day and realized that radio was gone and all the television had moved to Los Angeles. So they moved to LA in 1961. And they had me in 1964. So I was born 6 years after they were married. My mother always said they didn't try to have children and they didn't try not to have children. They just sort of were like, well, whatever happens, happens. She never wanted to really have children. She wasn't interested in being a mother. She was hit by a car and had a broken leg while she was pregnant. And she did keep working. She did my very first television appearance was in an episode of Petticoat Junction, in that I am inside my mother, whose broken leg and pregnancy was hidden behind a desk. I was born in St. Joseph's Hospital. My parents had bought the house I live in right now by then. It's right by the house. They were looking at a couple of houses. One was my house, which is near Universal, Warner's, Disney, and NBC. And the other house they were looking at was near MGM and Fox. They decided on my house. And then immediately my dad got a series where he had to drive all the way out to Fox every single day. Because that's obviously, what else was going to happen? Anyway, so I was born in St. Joseph's Hospital in Burbank. My mother says she was crawling up and down the table begging for a spinal. And afterwards, she was like, I must apologize to the nurses. I have to apologize. And my dad was like, don't bother. They've seen it all. You could not possibly have been the worst they've ever seen. So then my mother said, my mother who did not want two children, was not interested in being a mother, but was just gonna, she was gonna do it. It's not like she wasn't gonna do it. But she said she took one look at me. They put a little pink bow in my hair, put me in her arms, and I went. And she said at that moment she fell in love, and then she was a terrific mother. Obviously we had our things because we are mother and daughter, but she was a great mother. She was, however, a Belgian mother, and I met somebody once who also had a Belgian mother, and we were able to bond very strongly on that. My mother said the first time my father wanted her to make corn on the cob, she was like, but that's what you feed to the pigs. And so that was one thing, corn fed to the pigs. And this other girl, Rue, she was like, yes, corn is for the pigs. And the other thing is, of course, was Halloween. I mean, I was so lucky that I had an American father, because otherwise I would have missed out on shit. Because my dad was like, all right, it's time for Kimberly to go out for Halloween. She's old enough to go out for Halloween. My mother was horrified. She says, but that's for poor children. Because, of course, she gave out candy for Halloween, but she thought it was just for poor children who begged on Halloween night, not just for every child. Oh, yeah, and how I got my name, Kimberly. Again, American father. They were choosing names. I think Timothy was the name they came up with for a boy. That would have been my name if I was a boy. Girls' names were harder. My mom wanted to give me a French name. But my father from the Bronx, would pretend he was yelling it across the schoolyard. So she said, Chantal. Chantal is a beautiful name. And my dad goes, hey, Chantal. So she's like, okay, no, not Chantal. And then she remembered about Kim Novak and went, what about Kimberly? And my dad goes, Kimberly. Couldn't mispronounce it across the schoolyard. So that's how I got my name. Chantal would have been great, but yeah, constantly you'd have to be correcting people on how to spell, pronounce your name. And what kind of Chanty? Terrible nicknames. No nickname for Chantal.